My latest book, The Cassandra Syndrome, exposes a truth that shakes the very foundation of everything that we think is right and real. And my talk touches upon some of those issues. We are all well aware of those generous, kinder, humane qualities that sometimes grace our television screens. But all is not well in the shadowy side of human nature, and to which I must give attention, because it corrupts our humanity, inflicting division and destruction. I begin, therefore, in the hope that some light might reach those dark, forbidden recesses of the human mind and open doors long locked and bolted. There are times when I have stood in wonderment at the academic and creative brilliance within our species, but then get pulled up with a start by the eccentricities we carry that make no intellectual sense at all, because they are based on emotions and unsubstantiated ideas. These anomalies are the principal harbingers of our divisions and wars. We seem blind to the reasons that consistently steer us off course. Plato provided the answers to this in 300 BCE. His Plato's Cave depiction indicated that mankind is a comfort zone creature with a history of pursuing feel-good fantasies to which it then awards factuality, whilst habitually dismissive to uncomfortable facts as though they did not exist. These falsehoods then sully the sum of our decision making. The laws of mathematics state wearily to us that the aggregate inclusion of facts with fictions into our human sum must always transmute to negative physical responses. It is the endless equation of the damned. When we collect together the finished products of these distorts littering our history, this is what we achieve. After setting aside history's unrelenting millions of smaller battles, pogroms and collective killings, we find there's only been an aggregate 250 years of no major wars recorded in the last 3,400 years. A pattern that then tracks back through time. These are the destructive manifestations of the controlling social predator, and are perhaps most clearly understood through the works of psychologists H. Cleckley and Professor Robert Hare, leading world authorities on psychopaths and sociopaths. In 2004, there were features in the New Scientist periodical and the British national papers in which eminent British psychologists produced an expose of mankind's predatory psychopaths. It commenced with, there are predators in society, and these predators are psychopaths. They are always looking for feeding grounds. They represent 1% of the population. In the UK, this amounts to something in the region of 690,000, to which we can extrapolate to every other country. It follows on to say they are found in politics, enforcement agencies, judiciary, theology, in fact, wherever there is power or influence. When bringing all of this urge to control down to base level, its psychology is simply the fraternal manifestations of the primary street gang mentality, functioning beneath the guise of their official capacity. These are personalities whose debased mission in life, whilst getting the job done, is to impose dominance and fear and usability upon the vulnerable from within a secure power base. Unfortunately, it is towards these pillars of society that the young look upwards for guidance. The young are inquisitive, watching, listening, and learning. Consequently, they are aware of what really goes on behind the higher facades. Thus, the wayward young are a reflection of their betters and doomed to follow in the footsteps of these unworthy tutors. Tutors who then feel free to castigate their feral creations. The narrow view of science on psychopathy informs us that there is a biological basis for the drive towards domination and violence, for which there are markers. For instance, the MAOA gene helps to regulate serotonin. Too much in utero desensitizes the calming effect of serotonin in later life. For example, the warrior gene is made active, as it is also where limbic system malfunction is present. As a more useful mental picture, the predatory psychopaths are the cuckoos that own the nests. I shall reveal another side to this as we progress, one which takes us into a most astounding, beyond belief reality. The history of these predators is also clearly observed across all times by means of the emotional controls used over their subjects, and are noted amongst those earliest effigies of deification and the motley of idols and false gods that followed through history into our anthropomorphic monotheism. High on our list of predatory control is that great monotheistic conversion, whose cloud still hangs problematically over 21st century mankind. This concerns itself with one of the greatest recorded Walter Mitty world escapisms, one in which mankind allowed itself to be led en masse into a theological entrapment. This entrapment was engineered in 325 CE by the Roman Emperor Constantine, the most powerful chieftain priest of his time. Constantine's strategy began with the discarding of his people's pantheon of gods and deities through the imposition of his Romanized version of the Christian faith. During this period, Christian Gospels were destroyed, some 4,000, retaining only the 4 that were useful to his plans. All duplication were in Latin that few could read or understand. This was the beginning of the greatest witch doctor trickery ever foisted upon ingenuous masses. The linchpin to Constantine's plan was the Romanizing and incorporation of a Jewish messianic figure. His deceit became more achievable because prior Roman culpability in the execution of this figure had long since been diverted upon the Jews. Constantine's plan was to harness his people's passions to that of its very own messianic figure. By means of such interpolations, Constantine began to generate the most monstrous mind and body entrapment of mankind that had ever been conceived. All avenues of escape were sealed. Apostasy carried the death sentence. The doctrine of fearful purgatory was invented to stiffen allegiance and dissuade suicide. Any such attempts carried a fearful death sentence. The evil decree to prevent suicide was designed for one overriding intent. Information is power, and people cannot be tortured for information if they are already dead. The most lucrative of all information gathering was achieved through a system of local priests. They were so contrived as to be held in thrall, whilst also providing pseudo-salvation for the sinner in the confessional, a process that provided a rich source of feedback intelligence to the bishops. The confession of sins became more formally instituted under Pope Innocent III, following the Petrine system of enlisting popes for primacy over bishops. Constantine's evil legacies then left Europe submerged in a filth-ridden lunatic asylum for well over 1,000 years, during which countless millions of innocent heretics were murdered and unknown numbers tortured and imprisoned. Christianity had denounced all knowledge as the works of Satan, closed all schools, and destroyed all books that did not support its theology. The illustrious works of Greek philosophers were consigned, with their founders, to perpetual torment in hell. Other aspects of this ongoing godliness is still reflected through the paedophile exposure in religious institutions throughout history and into our modern times. Muhammad, 527 to 632 CE, was another major example of beguiling people en masse. He raised a great army and through treachery and massacre secured a vast empire. His shameful deeds and succession of unbalanced zealots that were to follow are all on record for anyone to access. An example from the Quran says in chapter 5, verse 56, "O believers, take not Jews and Christians as friends." And in chapter 47, verse 4, "When you encounter the unbelievers, strike off their heads. O true believers, if ye assist God by fighting for his religion, he will assist you against his enemies. But for the infidels, let them perish." In this same, now conveniently brushed out of sight way, we have that most loathsome 14th century Muslim decapitator, Tamerlane. His followers had at least 17 million people slaughtered, building a pyramid and hills out of severed human heads, deeds now passed down to knife-wielding Islamic State militants. There is nothing holy but something terribly satanic expressing itself in these unending theological crimes. The equally productive feeding grounds of the predatory psychopath is also observed in the secular religion of communism. Between them, the secular priests of Stalin and Mao Zedong brought a new dark age of terror, censorship and death to many millions of people. In this we see the clearest herd evidence of mankind's problematic follower instincts. For this, I have adapted the words of Abraham Lincoln. "You can fool all the people all of the time, except for a few for some of the time." There are some easily seen reasons why these asylum activities have never been brought to an end. They concern in part what I refer to as the unceasing suppression of the honourable whistleblower. These perceptive individuals who can see the wider, darker picture but dare not speak because of the crimes that officialdom would inflict upon them. In this we see the universal means, active through all times, by which the evil intent within aristocracy and its institutions remain in camera. It is through such means by which the perceptions of the masses are massaged to favourable directions. This example It's just one of the many inbuilt universal systems that ensures the preservation of evil. Socrates, in the 3rd century BCE, fell foul of what is now called PC, what I refer to as preclusion of articulate criticism. He was sentenced to death by his own hand for articulating too freely in the marketplace. I have gone thus far in making the case for the most ungodly, ongoing activities of our species. It is the elephant in the room that we pretend is not there. Our history reads like Dante's Divine Comedy, descent into satanic Hades. Yet on the other side of the coin, all cultures have the most certain, instinctive knowledge of their roots back to God. And there is a truth in this. Something had been taken away from our species, and for which we must address the causes. For this journey back to the supraordinate, we must follow the maternally inherited mitochondrial DNA and the Y chromosome inheritance that runs through the paternal side of our species. They link Homo sapiens right back to the pristine African Khoisan bush people, as do linguistics. As we go along, we will see how distant and different we have become from our pristine San ancestors, who were once equal and at one with the natural world and all its creatures. In consideration of our pristine origins, our minds are again left to ponder the genesis of the negative influences that found their way into our out of Africa ancestral souls. The answer was there all the time, in the laws of opposites. When good drops its guard, evil moves in. The pristine Khoisan were a light yellowish-brown in colour, and were passionate lovers of freedom with no concept of land or animal ownership. They had no clearly defined God, but an unshakable knowing of the supraordinate by means of their cerebral augmentation, mind connections. Through this they remained linked into the divine through guiding dreams, an age referred to as dreamtime. They were also animists, which attributes living souls to all creatures, whereby all matter and life were accorded due respect. The San lived in small, separate, non-hierarchical family groups, and were not dominant to one another, because violence was not in their nature. Collective assimilation with other family groups was avoided, apart from the occasional short-term ceremonial gathering. But perhaps above all else, the San were renowned for their generosity of spirit. The light skin pigmentation of the Khoisan is related to their simian origins. The reasoning behind this is that apes have light-coloured skin beneath their fur, whereby, as proto-mankind began losing their body fur, melanin response began to lightly shade the skin from harmful UV radiation. Subsequent degrees of skin colouring to later Homo sapiens were then determined by how close or distant to the equator, 0 latitude, their long-term settlements had remained. Once again the question arises, by what means could malignancy have emerged from out of pristine San origins? For that we are reminded again that all things are subject to the dynamics of opposites. Where there is order, disorder will also be seeking ascent. By this rule, even the most flawless of San families would father the occasional misfit, who would in time seek or be encouraged towards pastures new. It then follows that because like is attracted to like, disparate formations of similar nature would have begun to coalesce, and over time gradually drifting north towards Africa's equatorial zones, where they were to acquire much darker skin colour due to UV intensity and melanin response. It was in these regions that the control systems devised by baleful elements were to evolve in such a powerful mental and physical processing machine that its malignant precepts would remain extant for all future times. The fall of early mankind occurred here, with its conversion into negative social collectivization, tribalism, and is the advent of mankind's change into intermediate man. This first time amassing of people had brought dangerous internal forces into play that put them at risk. It proved to be fertile ground for the emergence of controlling personalities and supportive cohorts. Further empowerment by these personalities was then achieved by harnessing the passions and fears of its followers. The tools for that process came in the form of the first deified despotic witch doctor priests, tribal chiefs and monarchs. In time, these cunning few were able to position themselves above the herd as occupying forces, entrapping the many. Reference psychopathy. There is, for example, a more modern means by which to understand the nature of the mental entrapments that early man fell foul to during its collectivization, and by which early minds became programmed to the degree that it would sully the better possibilities of the kind in perpetuity. The defining example of such mental programming was to become known in our times as the Jesuits' indoctrination process. The Jesuits worked on the principle that early minds are most malleable and stated, "Give me the boy until the age of 7 and I'll show you the man." Thus, by exactly that same process, early mankind, Homo sapiens, fell foul of the mind and body entrapments imposed by its own predatory minority, and that would then set the mould for all times. A prime requirement of despotic leadership was the ownership and control of information and direction, and for which mankind's angelic guiding dreams stood in the way. This hallowed gift did not leave mankind quietly. It was eradicated willfully through time by ongoing coercive pressures of predatory leadership in their efforts for complete dominance. These greatest of all criminal acts took both the dream and the God out of man. This left an empty space within mankind's spiritual, emotional needs, a space then filled by the dark orchestrations of predatory leadership and its ersatz deities. This substitution still left unsatisfied emotional needs within mankind that through time would be filled by disparate shadowy attachments to pseudo-spiritual ways, and by which charlatan activity was also to become ensconced within our species throughout all times. A witch doctor priest lived on into modern theology. Tribal tyrants lived on as leaders, and all wars, old and modern, are precisely old tribal war reiterations, the same old born-again tribal repeaters, reapparelled to suit their times. But I wonder how many are aware that their ancestors had stepped out of Africa with very dark skin, and that any changes to that shading would have occurred to those ancestors who eventually settled in other places for great periods where the UV factor was very low, whereby their skin colour would gradually change towards lighter, whiter shades. This must surely put a different slant on those modern skin colour pejoratives. Hopefully it can be seen that the journey I'm following concerns only that of mankind's damaged soul, which we then express through our never-ending collective crimes. Moreover, this fall began as our Dreamtime God was being atrophied from our neural receptivity. As a rather crude analogy, it is rather like having our classic FM receivers decommissioned to that of the 1920s crystal sets. It was the Holocaust and a visit to the Somme in France that set me on the course to expose the negative elements in human psyche that factor into history's never-ending atrocities. This is to enter a minefield of spurious sacrosanct, wherein inquiry is in conflict with people's comfort zones, and therefore have always been carefully skirted around, but in doing so have ensured that yesteryear's nightmare issues are still with us today. With this in mind, I have endeavoured not to make the same mistake, but did so to the extent that I had obviously put something satanic under threat, as I shall reveal with other matters as we go along. We have a modern example of how easily people can be led astray. Today's sciences of psychology and neuroscience have moved closer together in a marriage of mutual super-empowerment. Moreover, their intentions echo that of theology in older times, a need to become the final judge and jury over the workings of the human mind's spiritual aspects and manifestations. It is worrisome, therefore, in these enlightened times, that this new science-led slant on a middle-aged control formula should again be making its unwelcome appearance, which of course is no more than another bridling institution seeking to bury the paranormal manifestation phenomena for the sake of their own aggrandizement and empowerment. Did they think we had not noticed that the United States Police and others often have their crime cases solved with the help of real productive psychics? In this effort to bolster their case against the paranormal, neuroscientists conducted experiments. They used electromagnets affixed to the skulls of volunteers, who then claimed to have had out-of-body experiences at one with their creator. These results emboldened psychology and neuroscience to state categorically that these experiments had finally proved that all paranormal activity was quite simply delusional activity taking place within the skull of the person experiencing it. Neuroscience further supported its assertions through technical jargon, stating that the paranormal activity is merely the neural stimulation of the temporoparietal junction, and from which originates all ethereal altered states of consciousness. Put another way, the paranormal is delusional activity due to neural stimulation of the brain's temporal lobe. The underlying message being sent is that all such experience can now be construed in layman's terms as a trip down the rabbit hole with Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. One might clearly observe from this scientific deception its own bit part in the coming together with all other dark elements I have previously outlined into the great orchestration of mankind's dark side sleepwalk. More and more I discover evidence that our darker collective activities carry otherworldly management. Now that must be a most startling comment, because it runs counter to all our beliefs. Nevertheless, I have empirical experience that there are indeed two great imperceptible opposing forces, one dark and destructive, the other angelic. Moreover, that this dark management was put into ascent at the fall of man, which then caused our disconnection from man's pristine angelic guiding dreams. It is when I get down to my own personal experiences that really puts the stamp of reality on all that has been said, and is perhaps best understood initially through the amazing works of the 14th century Dante's Divine Comedy. This is because my own personal journey parodies that of Dante's through Hades, with Virgil, his angelic protector. In a strange but similar way, I also have my Virgil, my angelic helper, blocking the more lethal deeds of a purgatorial darkness that dogs my journey and footsteps. Some lives are known before they are born. This also applies to mine. Moreover, it answers the reason why orchestrated chaos and death trailed my footsteps almost from the cradle. But I'll work my way into that as we go along. One of the most incredible manifestations of this otherworldly orchestration of both the environment and myself occurred whilst living in Australia at Surfers Paradise. I was a seasoned surfer and on the beach with others in the ankle-high shallows to keep cool. There would be no surfing that day. The sea was in ragged violence from the nighttime cyclone and all ships safely in port. Then, as I was about to walk over to my wife, something utterly unnatural above the shallow water level sucked me into the maelstrom, tossing me and the board I was hanging onto around like a rag doll. I knew death was only seconds away, but my own angelic influence had other ideas and brought a smooth rolling board rider's wave, untouched by the chaos, straight towards me, and I leapt upon my board. I was a quarter of a mile out to sea. How could that have happened in a few seconds? The wave took me all the way safely back to shore, and I had never heard of a board rider staying that distance on the same wave. The other grounded board riders rushed over, talking loudly about seeing me go to my certain death and the miracle of the smooth wave that rescued me. Then I had another shock. My wife said I had been in the sea for an hour. In terms of witness events of external forces actually manipulating the physical environment, there can be no greater example than this, and others that I will later relate. Whilst living in Cyprus, another unnatural episode occurred that literally sucked me over a low cliff on a calm day, and I was found unconscious later on the rocks below. Cyprus had more to offer. My wife and I were in a traffic tailback on a narrow two-way traffic road behind two large oil tankers. Eventually the cars in front drew away and it was our turn, as the road ahead was clear, except for a slow-moving car far ahead on the rising hill. But once committed, things changed dramatically. The car far ahead accelerated to full speed towards us, and then, as if in collusion, the rear tanker driver closed the gap between his vehicle and the one in front to prevent us saving ourselves in that space. A line of cars had arrived behind the tankers and would give us no room to return. We got through by a whisker, only because an unnatural calm had come over both of us that left us in wonderment afterwards. And orchestrating evil was at work, but so was something angelic. Another strange episode occurred in Cyprus. It concerned one of my sisters living in Australia, who for reasons of spite had broken contact with me 40 years previously. I sent her a letter of sympathy when I heard she had cancer. But what I did not know was that she had been taken into hospital palliative care soon afterwards. I was soon to discover that she was dying, and the tears ran down her face as she said, "I'll never leave this place, I'm dying." I know this because at that exact moment, thousands of miles away in Cyprus, a conversation with my wife was interrupted as tears ran down my face, and said, "I'll never leave this place. I'm dying." I was also battling against something trying to take away my soul. Naturally, my wife was totally bewildered. The following morning, we were told of my sister's demise. We discovered the dual experience had occurred at precisely the same moment, bearing in mind the 7-hour time difference. Something evil had also tried to send me on the same death journey. This is no delusion, it is reality. On another occasion, someone had slipped a tablet into my cool drink, and I was found later floating unconscious in the sea. So that was another close call. There are always many smaller, darker events happening, but I need to stay with some of the larger issues. Like an event on my way to Hampton Court, UK, along a narrow dual carriageway. The road had a continuous deep ditch on my left side, and at its end was a blind right turning. I was about to take that turning when two side-by-side speeding cars came round the bend straight at me. So I swung hard towards the ditch. My angelic helper was with me again. I found myself and car sitting quite unharmed in a cornfield, and had passed over a narrow concrete slab across the ditch and through an opening whose large farm gate had been left open almost as though I had been expected. There were plenty of other unusual events going on in my life. I have been having hundreds of angelic guiding dreams across the later years, which at times have been startlingly precognitive, and from which came clairvoyance and healing attributes witnessed by others. At one particular clairvoyant episode, I had attended a workshop on platform mediumship, which took place in a church hall. Eventually I found myself on stage staring into the large audience, whilst the medium organiser remained also on stage behind me. I got quite a shock. A road that only I could see had opened up in front of me, straight through the audience, and there was a man standing there whom I described and gave both his names. "That's my friend who died years ago," said the voice of the medium behind me. "How many children did he have?" "2, I answered. Then 3 fingers were shown from behind me to the audience. "Ask again," said the medium. 3, I replied. "Correct on both counts," the man informed me. "My friend had 3 children, but 1 died." I was gathering a lot more personal information about his friend, but was quickly thanked and matters brought to a close before I raised any unwanted issues. I could not have been more excited for actually being privy to the truth of survival, and no greater reality proof than a hall full of witnesses. One of my later angelic guiding dreams led me into the ability of healing. By the next morning it proved to be an amazing reality witnessed by others. Moreover, the greater understanding of what was going on in my life was shown to me in a dream, in which I was looking down upon myself from a high position. It showed a broad, well-beaten track used by the human herd mentality and displaying the destruction left in its wake. I was seen following a journey parallel but not upon the beaten track, and knowing that I had an important commission to achieve somewhere far ahead. I became aware of a fine umbilical cord attached to me that I knew had connections all the way back to the essence of things. Then I noticed in the distance that I was not alone, for there were white translucent figures behind that were protecting and covering up the cord as I travelled. It would be many years before I was shown the purpose of my dangerous journey. It came in a dream, and this is now sketched on the front cover of my book. This dream shows me in an ancient underground room. On one wall there are three recessed heads of the immortal three luminaries, and from each shone a light that converged on one spot, in which I was standing and holding my book. My position was in a slight recoil away from three dark figures that emerged from, to grasp for the book. In another dream, I was given the ability to find lost souls, and through this I found lost Siamese cats whilst living in Dorset, UK. It was in the local papers at the time. One of them, Willow, was missing in the woods and fields for 3 weeks, but he finally let me know clairvoyantly that if my wife and I were to arrive exactly at 8:45 p.m, halfway down a particular road in a village 6 miles away, he would come to her if she whistled once. And that is exactly what happened. In later times, whilst living in Cyprus, I found many lost pets, felines and a dog, with the same amazing inputs and details. The dark orchestrations of events around my life continued, though I did wonder at times whether the people close to me might also have benefited from my angelic helper. Rather like the time when my wife and I attended our local theatre in Hayes, Middlesex, to hear the Blues and Royals military band. It was discovered later that there was a 27 pounds of Semtex bomb underneath the theatre, planted by the IRA, but the fuse failed. There was also that time on an army battlefield training scheme where I had been asked to take a message to the CO. His tank was positioned on the top of a nearby hill. I drove the narrow track up to the tank and parked to its right side. It was as well I did. The engineers had just planted explosives at the other side, which detonated as I decamped my vehicle. The purpose of the large crater it made was to sight the tank within it, and so reduce its attack profile from an enemy in a real war. Something had saved me once again. Some of the strangest of evil otherworldly stage management came into my life very early. Setting aside a hospitalised near-death experience from a mastoid infection at the age of 2, I would in time look back and wonder if that had just been a rehearsal for the patterns of near-death that would later litter my life. Some years later, as a toddler, I was sent to the local newly built shops for my father's cigarettes. Fortunately, I had my Wellington boots on, because I had spotted an open-fronted shop with a large puddle on its floor. But unfortunately, paddling splashed water on a thick armoured electric cable and junction boxes, and I was ejected out onto the pavement in a gigantic explosion and a sheet of flame. It caused a housing estate to lose its electricity. Returning home, my mother was not impressed with my singed clothes or fused together hair, but within a week my stutter had gone and my skin returned to its normal colour. Within a few years, the insanities of otherworldly stage management began to exert itself through my father's violence. He would kick like a mule at the slightest provocation, and scream and bellow at the top of his voice as he manically thrashed with his leather belt. I think we both met our match eventually, when all his best efforts all they could achieve was silence from me, which at times caused him to collapse with arms and legs awry into a chair. The continuous noise from this reached all the neighbours, but in an odd kind of way they seemed not to have noticed. But he was not to be outdone, and began moving into his more lethal activities, where time after time I was engineered into situations where there was little hope of survival. Yet something saved me every time. as it also did for my older supportive sister. As my father was driving along a busy road in his 1930s car with my sister sitting beside him, the door flew open suddenly and mysteriously, and she was ejected into the road. He later told our mother that he had driven on for quite a while and was unaware that anything strange had happened. Eventually, when he returned, he found her in the gutter. She was cut and bruised and her shoes and socks were missing. He did not take her to hospital because they asked questions. I was now 10 years old and matters had reached a really low point, having just been reunited with some old enemies. A bucket of water, scrubbing brush, floor cloth and sunlight soap, all together in the early morning with my father in our kitchen. "Get scrubbing and don't miss an inch," he ordered, and that's how it went without a break until late evening. By then the top and bottom linoleum floors of our 3-bedroom house had been scrubbed a total of 7 times. It would have been more had I not escaped up the stairs. But he was hot on my heels, brandishing a stair rod from the stairs, and a first floor window offered the only available escape route, so I leapt through. I slept the late September nights in the local wood, covered in leaves. My older sister kept me supplied now and again with smuggled out jam sandwiches. Eventually a friend and I decided on an adventure to the River Thames at Gravesend. On arrival at our destination, we were awed by the mighty river and more so by the prospects that lay ahead. But we had come too far to get cold feet, and certainly for me there was no going back. So we got on with the business at hand. Having accessed the quayside, we surveyed all the possibilities that seemed to favour our plans, and made a decision. That night, whilst the Tilbury lights twinkled across the vast expanse of oily black water, we slipped over the quayside edge and down a rope, feeling occasionally with a foot to see if the dinghy we had previously noticed was still there. It was a small leaky little tub with 6 inches or so of water in the bottom, and an old tin can that needed no explanation. We cast off, and I pulled on the oars, directing our little boat towards the Tilbury lights, as my friend bailed furiously to keep the water at bay. I had set our hopes on a very large ship anchored about 1/4 mile offshore and 1/2 mile downstream. My strategy was to row in a straight line towards Tilbury, whilst the flow of the river would be pulling us seawards. By this method we should eventually arrive at the rear of the ship. It had not crossed my mind that the tide could easily have been going in the other way, which, with the benefit of hindsight, might have proved a great deal safer. Eventually we were far enough out that the river current would take us in a direct line straight to the rear of the ship, that we had fancifully imagined would afford us a smuggled trip to far off places. Our ship was now easy to see. It was lit up like a Christmas tree, but this could disappear within a few seconds in the event of an air raid warning, as would the distant shore lights from either side of us. Without those lights, the surrounding blackness would soon deny us all reference to ship and shore. But our position soon became much more serious, as the Thames rushed out behind an ebb tide, and the ship became growing at mind-boggling speed. To counter this, I quickly swung the dinghy 180 degrees until it was pointing upstream, and then rowed for all I was worth against the rushing waters. The procedure did little to slow our speed towards the ship's stern. It was probably the glaring lights from the ship that had prevented us from seeing the other disaster that was waiting, until it was almost too late. There was white froth at the rear of what had become a monstrous vessel. It was now scarcely 50 yards in front of us, with the gap closing fast, and we were soon staring at the blades of 2 enormous propellers. that were slowly rotating like giant egg beaters, and into which we were centred. The following seconds were a blur of controlled activity as I strove desperately to redirect the dinghy away from the propellers. We hit the rear edge of the vessel with a bone-jarring crash, just a few feet away from one of the propeller tips. The impact was so violent that it threw us in a heap at the bottom of the dinghy, losing the inboard oar in the process. It was from this position that we saw the vast rising cliff of steel above, as the current pulled our dinghy around the ship's edge and along its vast length. Where were all those ropes and ladders that always festoon the sides of the galleons in our comics? Without them, how were we to board this vessel and start the great adventure we had planned? As speedily as it came, the mighty ship retreated from our vision and then disappeared completely. We were soon to be lost within thick, impenetrable fog, paddling blindly all night with one oar, whilst my friend kept bailing out the water. A vague, misty dawn eventually found us drifting parallel with the treacherous, mud-lined shores of the Helstow marshes on the Isle of Grain. The open sea was next, had it not been for the dredger sitting low in the water across our bow. We made contact with a loud crash and scrambled on board and down a rickety causeway towards terra firma. We later resolved the ship's excessive height out of the water as being unladen and the rotating propellers accounted for by mechanical repairs being undertaken, or to help compensate for the tidal forces opposed on the anchors. Of course, there was no option but to return home, and luckily, nothing was said. Neither, strangely enough, were there any questions as to how my time had been occupied during those missing weeks, or the police informed of a missing child. So it remained my secret. Eventually, my parents produced another 4 children into a paradoxical domestic environment where the new arrivals were brought up in a normal way, whilst my supportive sister and I continued to live under the Hyde personalities of our Jekyll and Hyde parents. There is little doubt that the same external pervasive malevolence that had trailed my footsteps into the future had also been influencing and shaping my destruction from the outset. All this trouble because one day I would write a book that would expose the satanic conspiracy that deposed the angelic Dreamtime and opened a Pandora's box.